episode of the Right Ideas series, where we discussed thinkers or ideas relevant to the political right or topics that seem to be especially interesting to conservatives today. Today, we're going to do a first live interview. Usually our webinars are presentation style. We have a speaker or several speakers come in and present on various topics. Today, this is going to be more podcast style, where I will be discussing with our guest, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And then about a quarter of the way through our time together, I'll open things up to questions from the audience if you have any questions. Today, I am delighted to be interviewing Dr. Darel Paul. Dr. Darel Paul is a professor of political science at Williams College, and he is a self-described scholar of contemporary elite ideologies. Today, one very prominent contemporary elite ideology has to do with concepts such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what's sometimes called wokeness, or more specifically diversity. All of these things are not only of interest to conservatives today, as these concepts carry sort of political connotations that a lot of that are highly contested, and a lot of people seem to be very concerned about, but it's also of deep interest to the National Association of Scholars, as a part of our project and a part of my personal project, aside from these webinars, is to discuss and expose the way that universities have changed their basic mission in order to accommodate what Professor Paul might describe as a subset of elite ideologies. So I thought it would be very interesting to bring Professor Paul here today. Professor Paul, welcome.
Thanks very much, John. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start off by asking you about that self-description, a scholar of contemporary elite ideologies. What does that mean, and how did you become interested in this topic in your scholarly career?
So I think the answer to the first question, what does it mean, is it's about what elites, particularly elites in Western societies, because those are the ones that I study and those are the ones I know the best, what they believe, what constitutes their culture, what constitutes their values. And so what I think is particularly notable about elites in Western societies, not least of which the United States, is that they are societies that are very much dominated by professionals in the professional class. And so a lot of what I wind up talking about, writing about, and speaking about is the ideology of professionals and the professional class, but also kind of a larger elite that I would call the professional managerial class. So that's kind of a general discussion or description of what I do and have been doing for a while. How I got into this, I would say it is from living in the belly of the beast, quite frankly. I am Minnesotan, grew up in Minnesota, did my BA and my PhD at the University of Minnesota. When I came out to Massachusetts to take this position at Williams College in 2001, I really got a front row seat on same-sex marriage in the United States. If people remember, Massachusetts was the first state to legally recognize same-sex marriage. And so it just became a fascinating thing to me to watch the political process and watch the social transformation of less so the university, but more so the state of Massachusetts, and then as it kind of wound on, right, the United States, and how the ideas of a particular subset of the country, in particular the ideas of professionals, came to dominate the whole country.
And your book is called From Tolerance to Equality, where you take up that very question about elite acceptance of same-sex marriage, which, of course, as everyone knows, happened seemingly suddenly. Can you talk a little bit about what you explore in that book and some of your arguments?
Sure. So the book is a few years old now. It kind of takes us from the origins of this debate, particularly in the kind of 1970s, down to the mid 2010s. The book came out in 2018. And so the argument is really kind of contained in the subtitle, that the reason why the United States came to embrace same-sex marriage is that it came to understand the world in the way that the professional class does, and in particular the way that professionals really already had. And so the argument is in part a kind of a cultural story, but it's also a political story too. And so what I do in the book is use a lot of data and trace out the locations, the social locations of beliefs about same-sex marriage going back to the 1970s when polling organizations first started taking an interest in this, and kind of tracing it forward and seeing the historical evolution of these views and how they're located both socially, kind of in different social classes, but also geographically, regionally. And no surprise, I think, that the places where you see same-sex marriage come in the earliest are also the places where you have the most professionals. The places where same-sex marriage comes in the latest is where you have the fewest professionals. So that's kind of the theme of the book overall, and arguing that it's not about the kind of increase of tolerance. It's really about the change in ideology that is rooted kind of in class and in class culture.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a statement by Admiral Rachel Levine, the noted transgender, Biden administration official, who recently said that tolerance is kind of a bad deal for, in Levine's case, transgender people. They don't want to be merely tolerated; they want to be affirmed. It seems like this paradigm where you go from asking for toleration to asking for something more substantive than toleration doesn't just apply to the issue of gay marriage. It seems like it could apply to other issues of identity that have become very salient since the rise of gay marriage and the eventual Obergefell decision. Would you say that what you found regarding gay marriage is something that applies pretty easily to other issues of identity?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely, John. You heard the kind of language about equality and about affirmation and respect when Massachusetts was still debating this issue. The framing of it as a question of toleration was a political strategy. It was a political strategy designed to advance the particular goals and to disarm opponents, quite frankly. But the most honest people were saying it from the very earliest times, that it's really not about toleration. We don't want toleration. Toleration is not good enough. It needs to be affirmation. And affirmation is very much part of a bigger kind of cultural construct that I write a lot about, that I call the therapeutic. And so same-sex marriage is a really important part of the growth and development of a particular kind of culture that is especially rooted in the university. But as we know, with social justice, wokeness, whatever we want to call this thing, comes out of the university and kind of winds up sweeping the whole country, and then going abroad too. And it's in pretty much every English-speaking country in the world now, thanks to what began in the American university.
Yeah, a while back we had a webinar on Philip Reef. The idea of the therapeutic is very much a theme that has come up again and again in the discussions that we've had, and of course was very prominent in that discussion. So I want to get to that, but I think it'd be helpful to frame that discussion by talking about a short piece you wrote in 2018, which provides us with the title of this talk, Diversity, a Managerial Ideology. So in that piece, you show how diversity is one of these elite ideologies. You return to this point in several of your later pieces, I note. And you say that the cynical explanation for why diversity has become such a catchphrase, such a rallying cry, is maybe not sufficient. the explanation that says, well, people are looking out for their self-interest, and diversity is a beneficial thing for certain university administrators to promote. You say that doesn't quite capture what's going on, and in part because it seems like leaders of our elite institutions aren't just there's no evident cynicism in their embrace of this concept of diversity. A lot of them love the idea of diversity.
I'm not opposed to, I guess, what we'll call cynical arguments, material arguments. They're often good ones, and I think diversity is definitely a site of job creation for lots of people, and so I think there's something there for sure. But you're right, John. I think that doesn't capture very much, and doesn't capture what's, I think, most interesting, and therefore what's most kind of challenging and dangerous about the ideology. It fits into an overarching worldview. And I think that's probably the best, maybe kind of layman's way of thinking about an ideology. It really is the way you think about the world, what the world is made up of, how do all the parts of the world fit together, how do I fit into the world, how can I be an actor and affect the world. All of this stuff is wrapped up in what I'd call ideology. So it's a managerial ideology, I argue that, because it very much suits not just the interests of managers, but it also suits the way they think of the world. And the world for a manager is made up of different kinds of groups. And they don't have to be the kinds of groups we think of, right? Racial groups in particular, but also sexes and gender identities and national identities and religions and all of this kind of stuff, right? This has become just kind of common in the United States now. But if the world is made up of different kinds of groups, these groups don't spontaneously organize themselves, and they don't spontaneously cooperate. They need somebody to help them to realize all of these wonderful, as managers talk about today, we can hear it in corporations, all of the benefits of diversity, right? And so diversity is our strength. We know lots of these kinds of mantras. So in the managerial ideology, the manager is necessary to bring about these necessary forms of cooperation between groups that themselves can't really cooperate with one another. And therefore, the manager becomes absolutely essential. He's the central figure in the narrative of history, and his power, therefore, is essential for the common good, because bringing all these different kinds of people together with different kinds of skills who can't necessarily cooperate well, but the manager is going to figure out how to do that and put all the pieces together and produce equity, produce efficiency, produce self-realization, creativity, all of these kinds of goals that are not just kind of professional class goals, but they're also managerial class goals too that we see in corporations today.
Yeah, so we often hear about the business or educational case for diversity. In the article, you say that, quote, the academic debate over diversity's impact on the bottom line is largely, well, academic. Can you briefly give an overview of kind of what we know about how the concept of diversity is portrayed and what we actually can say about diversity, say in the workplace, what it does for say a corporation?
Sure. So I haven't kind of kept up devotedly with the literature on this topic over the last couple of years, but I can certainly speak to what the literature said maybe 3 years ago. Corporations have been dedicated to diversity, devoted to affirmative action, which is more or less the same thing. Not exactly, and we could talk about the differences if you want to later, but they've been devoted to this for a long time, right? Since the 1960s in the United States. So the belief under diversity is that you get a whole bunch of different people together and they can produce better sorts of outcomes than if you have all the same people together. And this might be relying on, psychological research about groupthink and whatnot. Better to have lots of different people with lots of different ideas around the table rather than a whole bunch of similar people with all the same ideas. It's kind of a kind of a sense, I guess, that seems to be probably right in some way. But there's lots of research, in fact, that indicates that there can be too much diversity too. You get too many people with too many different ideas, they just can't cooperate at all. So the simplistic understanding of diversity that you get out of the professionals and managers in America today is exactly that. It's very simplistic. It's not really rooted in the research. It's mostly rooted in ideology. It's rooted in what they want to believe about the world. There is not really very much good research that even indicates that diversity practices produce diversity, much less produce all the supposedly good outcomes of diversity, like creativity and efficiency and whatever else we have. And certainly corporations in America were never waiting to see, well, what does the research show? They have gotten into this from the earliest times, as I said, in the 1960s. And so any kind of academic research on this topic has just been trying to play catch up. And there's a lot of argument in this literature, and not everybody agrees, which is typical, I guess, of what you'd say in academia. The point that I wanted to make with that section of my piece in Quillette is that managers don't care what the evidence is. What they care about is the political and ideological dividends that they think that they can get out of it.
And that's made evident by the, what corporations actually do. They embrace ever more expansive DEI policies. When affirmative action is on the ballot or being challenged in court, they, as you've shown, they come out and almost exclusively support these kinds of policies, with maybe a few very rare exceptions where there's political pressure going in the other way.
Yeah, it's important, I think, to note that affirmative action, diversity, all of these kinds of programs have certainly been pushed on the private sector by the state. But I think that is not getting anywhere close to understanding why all of these things happen. So there are arguments out there, and I talk about some of those in an American Affairs piece that I published last year. I don't think this is a wholly wrong argument, not at all, but it doesn't get us very far, because most corporations are going well above and beyond what they are required to do by law to promote diversity. And you especially see that in higher education. They promote it not because they're forced to promote it, they promote it because they believe in it. Why do they believe in it? Not because there's a lot of great evidence that it works, that it produces some kinds of larger outcomes for society. They believe in it because it's part of their culture. It's part of their belief system. Sometimes I think it's worthwhile calling it a faith. It's their faith.
Yeah, and I want to get to that article soon. I think you're pointing to an argument that, at least in some circles of the right, have become has become just extremely popular. This idea that, as Richard Hanania puts it, wokeness is just civil rights law. The origin of this kind of obsession with identity, these sort of dogmatic tenets about the causes of disparities, all of these things that have created policies that many of us would find concerning. The argument is just that there's a kind of civil rights regime that's pushing all of this on corporations, and to some extent on even, say, universities. And so it's interesting to me that you provide an alternative. And I think that, the fact that these organizations, whether they be corporations or universities, are just so enthusiastic about promoting DEI or about promoting diversity suggests that there's something else going on. And I want to get to that in a second, but maybe as a good question to expound on this a little bit, you talk about how diversity is in line with this sort of ideology of managerialism, and you also talk about how there's a therapeutic element. What is the connection between managerialism and what you call the therapeutic?
I think the most direct connection is in this claim of managerialism that it is not just producing good things for the world, That is, we engage in these managerial practices, we organize all these different people together so that they can cooperate better, and therefore we produce better products, new kinds of ideas, cheaper prices, productivity gains, all of that kind of stuff, which there is a claim that they do all that. But there's also a claim that they produce better outcomes for the individual employees themselves. And so for a long time, managers in America have been saying things like, bring your whole self to work. And that there's all kinds of lists out there in America, right? The 50 best places to work in America and all of these kinds of things. They're promising to employees that you can come and work for us and you won't just have things like a good work home balance, or you won't just have like nice wages and benefits, right? Things that I guess, old fashioned people were interested in. You will have self-fulfillment. You will have kind of life satisfaction. You will realize who you truly are through working for our company. You hear this especially in tech, but I think you hear it in lots of places too. But especially, right, for professionals, right? You're not going to tell somebody, you're not going to give somebody this line if they are, waiting on the front desk at a hotel, or if they are, a delivery driver for UPS. You're not going to realize your true self. But, maybe if you're a creative director of an art program or an advertising, or maybe you're in computer programming or something, this is a plausible claim. So that claim that you're going to have a kind of a life project that is going to be fulfilled through your work in some particular corporation, that's the tie to the therapeutic. Because the therapeutic is a set of values and practices. I think at the center, right, is the self, and the claim that the self is going to be realized in society. As long as we can structure society the right way, every individual can realize his or her true self. And there's the connection, I think.
Yeah, and that makes me think there might also be a connection to higher education. And in your American Affairs article, you allude to this, maybe even explicitly, by saying that the structure of corporations for a long time has tried to imitate the structure of universities. Insofar, you even refer to large office complexes as campuses.
Mm-hmm.
You try to satisfy certain needs that go, as you said, far beyond the basic function of a corporation, just like universities increasingly do that. So I wonder if you can talk now a little bit about the tie-in with universities. So you say that diversity is a managerial ideology. We have this kind of implicit managerialism in a lot of elite circles, just based on the class status of people, who happen to occupy elite positions. And then you say that that's, connected in some ways to the therapeutic culture that, and both of those things seem to have a connection to universities. I want you to, could you tease that out a little bit?
Mm-hmm. The most important function of the university, I think, today, I guess this has always been true, though, right? It is the social locus in which the elite is produced. That's what universities do. Yeah, they teach people valuable skills. Yes, they are sites, especially since the late 19th century, for the development of technological growth and advancement, whether it's in industry or agriculture, all of these kinds of things. But socially, they produce the elite. And we very much see that today, right? It's almost impossible to be a member of the elite in America without having a college degree, particularly when you are in the elite of certain kinds of professions. You must have a college degree from an elite institution, right? Look at the Supreme Court, for example. And I think the further away you get from things that can be easily measured, like, what's the bottom line of this corporation? What's our profit rate? What's the efficiency rate? Those kinds of things. You're going to have much more weight being put on the eliteness of the school itself. So I think that's the most obvious tie between the kind of the managerial class and lots of things we've been talking about. But I think because they come ultimately from the professional class, which its most importantly, right, is formed by the university, because that's what it means to be a professional, is to accumulate this specialized knowledge, have that knowledge affirmed by a degree or some kind of certification, and then therefore exercise power in the world, supposedly at the interest of everybody, with your specialized knowledge.
So I want to talk about your American Affairs piece now. It's titled "The Puzzle of Woke Capital." And I want to start out by just asking you to define what it is you mean by woke capital.
Mm-hmm. So if you'll indulge me, I'll do the puzzle first, and then I'll kind of answer the question about what do I mean by woke capital. So the puzzle comes out of this, I think, long-standing incorrect belief. It's especially held by lots of people on the right, that capital and wokeness just don't go together, right? Capital is all about values of capitalism and values of kind of maybe a classical form of liberalism, and it's about the accumulation of property and individualism and all of these kinds of things, and it's just the antithesis of wokeness. And I think that's just false empirically. And so I'm trying to kind of understand why these things go together and seem to go together so well in America today. So by wokeness, I think it's easiest to point to some academic literature, and I don't want to sort of go too long on this and bore people too much, but there's some work by sociologists, Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning, Campbell and Manning, sociologists, who came out with this argument about what they call victimhood culture. And they came out with a couple of journal articles in 2014, and then they came out with a book a few years later. And they really lay out the essence of this victimhood culture. And then I think there's also a book by there's a book by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose that really lays out some of the epistemological foundations, right? They kind of rooted in postmodernism and the evolution of postmodernism away from being just kind of an academic project and really wrapped up in nihilism. I think it very much was, to something that's much more practical, and it's about wielding power in the world. And this is kind of putting together a society in a way that is fundamentally divided by these different identity groups. And this is, I think, how you can kind of see how it connects to managers, right? Managers are going to be interested in this kind of ideology because it's suitable for them and promises them an important position in the world, and it promises that they can produce all kinds of goods that come out. And I don't mean goods in terms of widgets, but good things in the world. So I think that's the best way and the kind of shortest way to sum up wokeness. If you want to call it social justice ideology, I think that's a good way of thinking of it too.
Mm-hmm. And so you pose several theories why woke capital emerged and why it's taken hold in corporations. And you say that each might have its merits, but it ultimately fails. And I want to draw out maybe two of them. One of them is the idea that advocating for social justice, especially regarding issues of identity, can allow corporations to mask the various things that they do that can maintain their power, or this is basically probably a more classic Marxist argument that you would see maybe in a place like Compact Magazine, where the idea is that this excessive focus on wokeness or on DEI allows corporations to basically get away with things that they are not, that are contrary to the purported ideals of social justice. So what do you make of this argument?
Mm-hmm. So I give a label to this. I call it the diversionary theory of woke capital. That is exactly as you said, John. I'm a capitalist. from kind of a left perspective, I'm engaging in all kinds of bad things. And so I go off and I kind of tip my hat to woke nostrums. And this supposedly is going to fool all these stupid left-wingers, and they're going to love me. Because, right, one of the examples that I use in the article is, I've forgotten the exact name of the investment fund, but the ones in New York City who put up the Fearless Girl statue a couple of years back, and so why did they do that? Well, some people said, well, it's because they had this lawsuit that the Department of Labor brought against them for unfair labor practices, especially regarding women. So here's what they can do: they can come out and they can pretend to be super woke and very feminist, and it's gonna it's going to throw up dust in the eyes of left-wingers who apparently, by this theory, are amazingly stupid and can't figure out what capital's doing. And so therefore it builds trust, it builds support and legitimacy for them. I mean, I don't think it's absolutely wrong. I think there's teeny bits of evidence for it, like the example, the Fearless Girl statue that I just mentioned. But I don't think there's enough evidence. I think it presumes that people are very easily fooled by these kinds of actions. And so, not to say that there is no kind of public image or public relations goal here, but that can't tell us very much, especially when there's all kinds of examples that we can find of corporations that encourage and unleash backlash on themselves, right? They go off and they do these woke social justice activities, and the vast majority of people, including their own consumers, hate them for it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So the other I think explanation that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is this explanation from Richard Hanania, the idea that wokeness is just civil rights law. Can you give a little bit of a summary of that explanation, because it's an interesting argument, and I understand why a lot of people gravitate towards it, and then maybe some thoughts on why you ultimately disagree.
Yeah, I think Hanania is a really good example of that. And I think Christopher Caldwell, right? He had a book that came out a few years ago that I think basically made this similar argument, at least. I think those are the right places to go to and see exemplars of them. Again, I think it's not wrong per se, but I think it's vastly insufficient, because I think it's clear that corporations go well above and beyond what they are required to do by law. You can see this in the history of the evolution of diversity, and before that, affirmative action offices. In fact, the very definition of what discrimination is and how you would even identify it was not created by law. It was created by corporations who had the law, right? They had the 1964 Civil Rights Acts, but nobody really knew what all these words meant. And so therefore, corporations are facilitating the evolution of the law. They're trying to define the law in certain kinds of ways that are beneficial to them, both materially, but also in terms of the ideology that they want to advance. I think, at least to me, there's some pretty convincing arguments that I've read that the kinds of practices, the kinds of diversity practices that corporations do today are exaggerating what the law requires. They go way too far. There's this very exaggerated fear of lawsuits. Now, I think people like Hanania and Caldwell would say, no, I think there is genuine fear of lawsuits, and that's why they do what they do. But I think I've read pieces by human resources professionals who have claimed that most corporations are doing too much, going too far, if it's only a matter of compliance. They go beyond, in part because they want to, but I think it's probably better to think of it in more specific ways. There's lots of people who are hired on to do these jobs in corporations, in universities, right? The expansion, especially in the university, of bureaucratic staff over the last generation or so means that now you have full-time employees whose job, 40 hours a week, is to promote diversity. And so it's coming from inside the firm, I think, much more so, although not wholly, than coming from outside of it.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that expansion within universities, and it struck me recently when somebody asked me How many diversity officers could a university cut before they run into compliance issues? And I've really never thought about that, because the existence of diversity officers is, at least from what I have seen in university policy, it's typically not couched in terms of compliance, and and what they do, tends to be just various versions of promoting kind of race-conscious policies and extension of affirmative action, much more than it's, trying to avoid lawsuits. I think there are probably examples of that happening, but at least from what I've seen, these major DEI policies that come up in universities tend not to have much to do with trying to avoid lawsuits, even though that might be at least the stated reason in some corporations.
It's interesting, right? You see a lot of DEI officers complaining that the higher ups, the kind of the executive management level, don't take them seriously. And I think that's a really interesting insight into the way this stuff kind of works, because it may be that the people at the top, right, the CEOs, are just going through the motions. Although I think a lot of CEOs certainly seem to believe it. I guess that's kind of a judgment call. But when you get closer to the heart of these projects, for example, in the university, the DEI bureaucracy, or in human resources departments of big corporations, you see the true believers, and that's why they exist. They were hired to do this work all day, every day. And so it may be that lots of these offices have run away from the original sources of power that created them in the first place. And so they've kind of grown into be these Frankenstein monsters that can't be controlled anymore. But at least when it comes to higher education, which is obviously a field I know a lot better than industry in America, I don't see too many presidents of colleges and universities having much of any interest in reining in their DEI bureaucracy. They want more, and they want to empower those people.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that a lot of DEI initiatives are, really created by faculty on DEI committees rather than DEI officers. There are some places, like maybe Ohio State, where there are 132 DEI officers. They seem to be doing a lot. But there are other places like, Texas Tech University. We just wrote a piece about how their Department of Biological Sciences started really heavily weighing diversity statements, and we got a hold of how they evaluated job candidates for their demonstrated commitment to DEI. And that, to my knowledge, was not conducted by diversity officers at all. It was all done within academic departments. So it seems like something else besides just a desire for compliance is what drove that kind of policy, and what drives a lot of people in these sort of highly credentialed professional positions.
Yeah, it's part of the class culture, I think, to believe in these things, and therefore to want to promote the policies that are supposedly going to realize the goals and virtues that the class believes in. There are, I think, just too many cases, especially in academia, let me take a step back. Academics are a notably left-wing profession, culturally especially. And so therefore, when you're looking at, the possibility of mandating a DEI statement for all of your job candidates, what most people do is they don't sit back and think to themselves, what's the ideal way to interview or to ask for materials from potential job candidates? What they do is they say, what should I do? What are the right kinds of practices? What are the best practices? Yeah. And so anybody who's able to set best practices, which tends to be the elites, right? If Harvard and Yale are doing it, it must be good. And so these things can then trickle down, and sooner or later, everybody's doing this kind of stuff because it's just come to be accepted that this is the right way to behave. These are the right values to hold, and therefore this is the right way to interview job candidates, for example.
Yeah, that's definitely true. It's very amusing to count the number of universities that use this rubric for evaluating diversity statements that came from UC Berkeley. So UC Berkeley, prestigious public university, possibly the most prestigious public university out there. They released this rubric and began using diversity statements much more intensely in around 2017. And it is certainly the case that if a university uses some sort of guidelines for assessing diversity statements, they're using an adapted version of UC Berkeley's. That process of looking out for what you ought to do and imitating best practices certainly seems to be a driving force in these kind of higher ed DEI policies.
And I think, John, that this is the heart of what it means to be a professional. We are defined by peer review. It doesn't really matter what the masses out there think of us. What matters is what we think of ourselves. And so therefore, academics are highly open to social pressures and not so much pressure as in I'm going to force you to do something. It is that I'm going to show you what the right way to behave and think is. And if we are all mostly concerned with what our peers think, and our peers are the ones that define best practices and the right ways of thinking, then we're about the last people to be the independent thinkers who are charting new pathways. We're going to be highly socially conformist. And I think that's exactly what you see.
And you say this is how professionals think. It seems that these sort of social or professional class categories play a big role in your account of untangling that puzzle of woke capital. So how would you say you kind of solve the puzzle in your article, and how do you think about solving this puzzle? Whereby, woke capital is not sort of a contradiction, but actually something that makes complete sense given the people who hold power in, elite circles.
So the unraveling, if you will, or the solving of the puzzle is by breaking the groups of people inside corporate America that have power into their constituent parts. And I think the simplest way, and I think it's still an effective and accurate way of doing so, is to separate the managers from the professionals, right? You see wokeness from corporations in certain kinds of fields. You don't see it so much in others. You see it in fields where there's lots of professionals, where there's a lot of call for creativity. You don't see it from, railroad companies and oil companies and things like that. You see it in entertainment. You see it in sports, right? You see it in these kinds of fields. And so what I think is happening is that wokeness is a concession, if you will. Corporate wokeness is a concession to the professional class employees of the firm. To the extent that the professional class employees have power, they're going to try to pressure their corporation to be woke, to carry forth social justice kinds of policies, especially things that I think managers are probably more than happy to do, which is issue important statements about how they feel about whatever happens to be going on in the world at the time, in exactly the same way that college presidents do. I think there's not a lot of difference between being a college president and being a CEO of a company in this way. And so what I think that's where the explanation comes from, is that firms that have a lot of professional class employees who have a lot of power force their corporations to be woke, and therefore kind of set the cultural tone for the whole organization. But the way, therefore, of combating woke capital is the undermining of the power of the professionals inside those firms. And I think that's what you've begun to see just over the last 6, maybe 12 months, right? The tech industry, I think, is a great example of this. Expanded tremendously in COVID, right? Everybody's online, everybody's doing Zoom. Tech companies beef up and hire a whole bunch of people. And we see these kind of extreme moments of wokeness from tech companies. And over the last 6 to 12 months, tech has been shedding lots of workers. And I think tech has become markedly less, at least openly less woke because of that. Plus, you're seeing some political pushback, right? Everything that's going on in Florida with Ron DeSantis and his administration is, I think, also an instance that the political power of the state matters too. And so if the right can capture state governments, for example, they can use that power wholly legitimately, wholly through the law and democratic procedures to rein this stuff in.
Yeah, and I want to get to some maybe practical, almost policy answers like you're alluding to in a minute. I'll remind the audience that in a few minutes we'll get to audience questions if you have any. So feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll ask ask them to Professor Paul. But I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about the connection then between the university and this kind of pressure from professionals on corporations that you seem to say is integral to the existence of woke capital. What a lot of accounts of where we are today find their origin in point back to universities. University English departments started postmodernism, or universities embraced Marxism, or there are sophisticated and crude versions of this. But I'm kind of curious what your take is on the relationship between the university culture, and what we see more broadly culturally today.
I think it's pretty clear that wokeness, woke culture, social justice, victimhood culture, if you want to follow Campbell and Manning, it has its origin in the university. That's where it comes from. We can just kind of trace that historically. It leaks out, if we want to use that kind of analogy, through people leaving the university and then going and occupying positions in corporate America or other kinds of institutions, NGOs, the state, all of these kinds of places. The fact that so many Americans pass through institutions of higher education is part of this story too. If you only had a small number of people going through this, it'd be very difficult for that group of people to kind of take over the general narrative of the whole society, or at least half the society, one of the two political parties inside that country. So I think just the sheer numbers of people moving through is part of this story. The fact that these are powerful people because they have credentials, they have skills that employers are interested in, and they bring their political ideology with them. Some employers aren't real interested in what their woke employees may have to say, but others are. And I think they are because they just are an overwhelming force. Publishing, I think, is a great example of this, right? The fact that the publisher of Roald Dahl's books decided that they just had to hire a sensitivity reader who was going to correct all of the troubling language in Roald Dahl's books is, I think, fantastic evidence of this, right? The state is not forcing them to do this. They think it's the right thing to do. Why do they think so? Because everybody who works in these organizations, especially in places like publishing and especially in NGOs, are all of a similar kind of viewpoint. They all agree on not just one or two issues. It's a vast array of issues. You have to have the right kinds of ideas on transgenderism, on same-sex marriage, on climate, on race relations, on police, on all of these kinds of things. And so it becomes this overarching kind of cultural formation that is going to have a lot of power in places where you have a lot of professionals and a lot of kind of endeavors that are highly susceptible to the manipulation by professionals. That is, it's kind of hard to know, what's the value added of what you're doing? How can I really know if you're kind of working real hard all day? That's a lot of what professionals have extracted from society. You have to give us lots of autonomy. And the promise is, if you give us lots of autonomy, we're going to produce all kinds of great things for your society. But it's really hard to kind of constantly look over the shoulder of professionals and make sure they're doing, X, Y, and Z. You kind of have to step back and trust them. And that gives them a lot of power.
So one audience member asks, and I'll just go ahead and read the question. They ask, what is your take on the debate between Burnham, that's James Burnham, and his young followers, whether the core of the new class is to be seen in the managerial class alongside the government bureaucracy, or the broader intellectual class of academic and media or similar institutions, or does your professional class category provide the middle term for them both? I think maybe a good way to put this question is who counts in this this professional class, or perhaps you could you give us like a taxonomy of elite classes relevant to what you're talking about?
So in my same-sex marriage book, I go through what may be to some in painful detail. Thankfully, it's only in an appendix on how I exactly define these kinds of things. And so the professional class is much bigger than the managerial class. A lot of the taxonomy that I use comes out of sociology, and it's a taxonomy that is used now in the British government and British government statistics, and you can kind of import that stuff into other countries like the United States. Taxonomies about jobs and positions in jobs, to make it kind of the most bluntly, if you will. There's two relations to capital. Either you own it or you don't. The vast majority of people don't own capital, right? They're not owners of corporations. So that's not particularly interesting, because it's probably like 99% to 1% or 98% to 2%, whatever. And I'm not talking about, I have a TA, a CREF fund, and I've got stocks in that. That's not what I'm talking about. Actively managing corporations. What's more interesting is how much autonomy you have in your job, and therefore how much and also how much authority you have over other people. Managers have a lot of autonomy and a lot of oversight over other people, and professionals have a lot of autonomy, generally not so much oversight over other people. If they did, that would kind of make them managers, but they have a lot of professional or shall we say specialized skills. And this taxonomy divides it in between upper and lower. So you'll have higher managers and lower managers, higher professionals, political scientists at Williams College, for example, doctors, lawyers, psychiatrists, these kinds of people. Lower professionals might be K through 12 teachers, social workers, et cetera, et cetera. This is the kind of taxonomy that I use, that just comes out of some branches of sociology and is used by the British, as I said, the British state in their census categories. So I think it's useful to separate the managers from the professionals, because even though they share a lot, they're also different enough. They have different positions inside any capitalist economy. Therefore, they have some different interests. And I think understanding what capital requires you to separate those two from one another. I think Burnham is really interesting, and I like Burnham's work. The thing is about Burnham is that it seems to be a way for Americans to not have to read any foreigners. Right? Foreigners have been writing about class relations for forever. Burnham is kind of this big American figure who writes about it. I think Burnham's great and all, but I don't think we need Burnham, and I don't think we need to keep resurrecting Burnham's ideas to talk about class in America today.
Your discussion of professional class makes me think of a question that I've had for a long time, based on my own, my day job as somebody who researches kind of the ideological pressures in higher education. I would say, and I say this having, spent the last 2 years reading just thousands of university documents related to DEI, that the discipline most invested in DEI is medicine. Medical schools are far and away, more than law schools, more than any humanities departments or disciplines. Medical schools seem to be the most invested in promoting social justice. I mean, to give just one example, the UNC School of Medicine, which is pretty highly ranked, in 2020, immediately after students made demands, they created what they called the task force for integrating social justice into the curriculum, and it included steps that would seem radical in any area of the university. You know, this was they had a list of required core concepts that professors needed to adhere to in their lectures. They had a list of political and social causes that they thought students should learn how to advocate for. They decided to put DEI into their promotion and tenure policy, which is a pretty common thing for medical schools to do now. You know, it's common in general in higher education, but medical schools are one you know, place within higher education where it's exceedingly common. So I wonder if you have any you know, I know you haven't looked at this, probably haven't looked at this issue too closely, but given your kind of taxonomy of you know, the elite classes and the way you divide things, and you know, I assume medical professionals are kind of, as you say, in that kind of higher level of professional classes. Why, you know, how might that help us explain why they are so uniquely invested in DEI, or does it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So I didn't know about the kind of ubiquity of DEI statements in medical schools, although I assume most, if not all of us, have seen, you know, some of these pledges that doctors take at the beginning of the academic year, and some of the, quite frankly, crazy DEI things that they have to wind up pledging themselves to, right? You know, the land acknowledgements and the historic injustice of this and that, just to, you know, kind of take classes in biochemistry and whatnot. But it's not surprising to me. And the reason is because in tracing out the historical development of support, or I call it, in my book, I call it the normalization of same-sex marriage, where it begins in the professional class is in what I think we can still call the helping professions. It begins in psychiatry and psychology and counseling and social work. That's where it all begins. And I think it begins there because this is the root of the therapeutic. This is where the therapeutic ideology takes hold first in America. It goes through medical organizations, certainly too, but it comes from psychiatry into the broader field of medicine, you know, pediatrics or whatever else it is. But that's my kind of gut sense of why medicine is so particularly devoted to this, because it is really devoted to the therapeutic, and it's rooted in these wings of medicine, particularly psychiatry, that have been rooted in the therapeutic for 50 years or more. I think that's part of it. The other thing I'll say, and this is just kind of venturing a guess, is that medicine, I'm guessing in America, is it's a very white profession, or maybe it's very white and Asian. Those are who are overrepresented. So these are very accomplished people who are very left-wing, who probably feel very guilty about themselves. And so therefore, this is also a way of expunging some of their guilt. You're not going to see this as much, I think, in professions that are not as dramatically white and Asian as medicine is.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In your article on Woke Capital, you kind of end by alluding to how there would need to be sort of a more big picture, long-term project to, I guess, in my words, decrease the relative power of the professional class if you really want to address the ways that you know, the problems that we associate with woke capital. Can you talk a little bit about, if I'm characterizing you right, can you talk a little bit about what a project like that would look like?
Sure. I think so. The two things that I do mention in the article, kind of briefly towards the end, is taking on the NGO industrial complex. It's a great term. It's not mine. I didn't invent it, but I think it's a really nice one. Obviously, it echoes President Eisenhower's statement about the military industrial complex right back in his farewell address in 1960. because there's a lot. This is a site where the professional class has a lot of power through NGOs and through the foundations that financially support them. So to diminish the power of NGOs and the kind of NGO sector, I think is a big part of the story. The other is universities, to try to reform universities. Since still in America, I mean, less so than any other country in the world, but even in America, the public universities are where the vast majority of people are going and getting their degrees. And this is a lever that obviously state governments can pull. And so I think trying to change what goes on in the university sector is also a really important political strategy. We're seeing that, right, in Florida. And I guess I haven't looked at DeSantis's policies in depth enough to kind of have a really well-formed opinion on them in the specifics. But I think in general, it's politically beneficial, it's democratic, and I think it has the possibility of being really effective. I have heard people claiming that not only the left should oppose the kinds of things the state of Florida is doing in higher education, but so should the right. And every time I see these claims that the right should oppose it as well, they don't actually have any arguments. Or the argument is, yeah, well, someday when the left comes to power, they're going to do mean things to you. It's like, this is the world that we live in now in terms of higher education. I don't see that the right has anything to lose from pursuing and supporting the kinds of policies that DeSantis and maybe, in places like Texas and other states are beginning to pursue. We can argue about some of the specifics, and that's good to do. But in general, I think it's the only sensible way forward.
Yeah, I certainly think there are some people who make kind of good faith, almost pedantic arguments about ways that legislation can be too vague or, in principle, open the door for violating academic freedom. I think those are arguments worth having, and it'll be interesting to see where the legislation, which at the time of recording this is still just kind of proposed, it hasn't been passed, where that's going to go. But it is very interesting to see how prior to, when Christopher Rufo and several other prominent conservatives were made trustees at New College, almost immediately, even a lot of centrist critics of kind of social justice ideology immediately expressed deep concern, as if merely putting these people into positions of power was itself kind of a violation of core principles that were important. And I think you're correct. A lot of the articles that came out saying that this is a travesty basically said that before anything had actually even been done. So it was just based on the assumption that these are bad people who are going to somehow mess things up. And I guess maybe that attests to the idea that this commitment to kind of social justice framework is really deeply rooted, and it's even something hard for critics to fully let go of.
I think you're right, John. It's the culture of our class. And even if we're dissenters, it's still the water that we swim in. And so it's very difficult to kind of adopt a wholesale critique of it. But also, I think what you see is a lot of people on the right who are just very, very afraid of exercising power, full stop. They don't want to exercise any power. And so therefore, how do we change things? How do we make them different? Well, I guess we just kind of talk to people. We have some kind of cultural renewal. I don't know what exactly the belief is, but it's I think a desire to escape politics. Wouldn't it be great if we could just live in a world without politics? And I don't think that would be a great world, but also I think it's an impossible world. We have to engage in politics. I think what's going on, at least in a general sense, again, we could debate the minutiae and specifics, but in a general sense, what people like Abbott in Texas and DeSantis in Florida and other governors are doing is wholly within the legitimacy of democratic politics. These are state institutions, and therefore, if the people of these states want to exercise their democratic will in particular ways, they should be allowed to do so, or at the very least to try to do so, and rather than and not to have people say, oh, no, 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 let's not even bother to try, let's just wish and hope and live in fantasy land.
Yeah, and this discussion brings me to a good closing question, and I know I haven't gotten to every audience question. I'll in a minute I'll give everyone my email address. You can send your questions to me so that I can forward them along to Professor Paul. But I'm wondering, you're talking about an elite class. I'm wondering whether you think the development of a counter elite is the proper way to think about moving forward, and if so, whether you think that there are productive ways to create a counter elite through our public universities. Yeah, I think you're correct. A lot of people have been hesitant on the right, have been hesitant to use state power, but you're seeing more and more people being willing, within the bounds of what they're allowed to do, say, no, we have a certain vision for what the university ought to be, and we want to execute that vision. So if given that there's this group of people now, how would you maybe advise them in that project of creating a counter elite through universities?
I think the way you framed it is exactly the right way to frame it, John, right? That we, even in a democratic society, will have an elite. There's no way around it. Every society has an elite. So the question for all is not, shall we have an elite or shall we not? It is, what kind of elite shall we have? And so certainly those on the right have views on this matter and should therefore try to create, I think, what clearly has to be a counter elite, because it's certainly not the elite that we have today. How to do so, I think the university's got to play a role in that. And so therefore, I think some of the reforms, especially what the DeSantis administration has in mind for New College, seem to be very much on the margins. And so it's almost like a demonstration project, I take it to be. Let's see if anything can work at all. But it might not be within the institutions that we already have, right? Some institutions may just not be capable of being reformed. And so maybe there have to be new ones. And I think a journal like American Affairs is really a good one and an interesting one in thinking about these kinds of matters. So in writing my piece on woke capital, I read and really reflected on a couple of pieces in American Affairs that exactly had this idea. We haven't always had the university. There haven't always been, all research, all knowledge has not necessarily been created by and through the university. And are there new kinds of institutions as well that we could think up and therefore to support? I don't have an agenda on that matter, but I think that kind of creative thinking is exactly what should be happening. Try to reform the institutions that exist to the degree that they can be, but also create new ones and to support those new ones as well.
Well, on that note, we will conclude our interview, but I want to thank both you, Dr. Paul, and our audience members for a really fun discussion. Thank you so much. I hope that everybody who is watching this webinar, if you have questions, you're welcome to send them to me. My email address is Sailer, SAILER, @nas.org. I'll pass them on to Professor Paul. And Professor Paul, your work is fascinating. If people want to read your writing, where should they look?
So they can look at American Affairs. They can look for my book, which came out through Baylor University Press, and they can look at First Things, which I have quite a lot of work there.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, once again, and I hope everyone has a great